Welcome to Entromy's Private Equity Impact Series, where we bring you real stories from the field that showcase how data, insight, and advisory experience converge to accelerate value creation with some of the largest private equity firms in the world. In this episode, I'm joined by Landon Lynch, founder and principal at MOTiV People Strategies, for a candid conversation about one of the most overlooked yet critical factors in deal success: CEO succession. Today, we'll dive into why founder transitions often stall post-close, how deal teams can better assess leadership risk during diligence, and how internal succession planning can directly impact valuation. Whether you're a PE investor, maybe an operator, or even an advisor, this conversation offers actionable insights on aligning leadership with value creation. Landon, welcome.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks for including me.
So you and I have both seen, firsthand how leadership dynamics can accelerate or in some cases derail value creation. And, one of the most sensitive and strategic inflection points is a CEO succession, especially when a founder is involved. So if you don't mind, I'd love to jump into maybe some of the hard stuff. Why is this such a persistent blind spot for deals teams?
Well, I think obviously it's a really kind of complex reality. You've got a whole bunch of different people, if you break it down, a whole bunch of different people's definitions of success, and they're all kind of colliding at this one inflection point. And it's for the CEO that's coming into taking on capital, a lot of times this is kind of a life-changing moment for them. And most of the time, even if a CEO, especially if it's a founder CEO and they're kind of a 3 to 5 year CEO, they just don't know what they don't know. They don't know necessarily what they're stepping into. They may have heard something about it from some of their buddies that have had exits. They may have gotten to have some really productive conversations during due dil with the deal team and with other CEOs who have worked within their portfolio, or there might have been a number of other context setting sorts of conversations, but it's hard to really prepare somebody for the impact of having a check written to you that completely reshapes your reality financially. And even if you have money that you're rolling over, and you just don't show up to work exactly the same way the next day. We all want to think we would. I think everybody thinks I'm going to be just as committed. I want to be able to hand this off to the next group of people. I want to be able to create this succession plan. I want to be high value for at least these next 2 years that I committed to. But everything changes in that moment at some kind of foundational level, and it impacts every single person differently. And so I just think there's a lot of, we think we know what's going to happen. The metrics all point to this could be a really aligned situation for everybody involved. We've set things up, and then the moment actually happens, and then you have to be ready to respond to that reality, and you just can't predict it all.
Yeah, I think about the analogy of a lot of sports and athletes. And, when they're handed maybe their first big contract or maybe their first extension after their rookie deal, a lot of GMs in the sports world have a little bit of a nervous time with how is this person going to respond to life-changing opportunities? It's not that they're thinking that it'll always go bad, but there's just, nervousness maybe is the right word to use.
Well, but I think to your point, right, it's not that it always goes bad. It's just that it can't be predicted, right? Like even if we're perfectly aligned from what the founder says they want and what the deal team says they want, and kind of the direction that we're all headed and how it all lines up on the spreadsheet, like there's always going to be some kind of a surprise because we're humans and we're thrown into this inflection point kind of moment. I think the other piece maybe to add to the financial reality is just, for most founder CEOs, they just haven't operated within a PE reality, right? There's a very real transition from, the way we talk about it, right? Going from running an 8-minute mile to a 6-minute mile, and having to try to discuss like what are the real operational implications and leadership implications and communication implications of having to transition the way that we operate from this very rubbing shoulders together, being able to communicate effectively because you bump into people at the water cooler, so to speak. We have touch points 10 times a day reality to operating at scale effectively. It's a different mode of operation, both in speed, frequency of touch points, and so many others. And so it really requires a reskilling a lot of times of the executive team, and particularly that founder CEO along with it.
So, Landon, you've worked closely with founder CEOs in several portfolio environments, maybe many portfolio environments. What patterns do you typically see when it comes to their intent post close, and where does it tend to break down?
I think one of the biggest consistent places that this is probably on the less tangible side of the spectrum is just that there's this consistent desire to leave a legacy with the work that they've done, but how they go about leaving that legacy has to shift when you start thinking about an organization at scale versus where a lot of founder CEOs previously found that sense of satisfaction was through that really close cadre of people that they got to kind of rub shoulders with on a daily basis. And they got to know everybody. They got to be the face for good or for ill. But there's so much of a shift, and they so desire. I mean, they started the organization so often because of this sense of desire to make impact, to solve a big problem within an industry they cared about, or for a specific customer avatar that they really cared about. And there was this real high focus, and now that focus transitions, and they have to figure out how to kind of recapture focus around legacy and impact within this new environment. And I think sometimes, though it's desired, though they really still have that within them, the new structure requires almost a process to recapture that if they're really going to enter into it and embrace a sense of purpose within the new environment.
So, Landon, I'm going to ask you about assessing risk in just a second. I came across an interesting stat. We often say that 90% of the pipeline runs through the CEO, then we're really talking about a CEO-led sales organization. And sometimes that's not actually leadership. That's really fragile for the organization. What's your take on how to assess that risk, and what are some things that companies or those deal teams should do to mitigate that risk?
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, I think with as data driven as I've experienced a lot of deal teams being, which is, it's neither good nor bad, it just is. I think it's just something to acknowledge. I think, almost as a shameless plug, I think your OHB product, organizational health baseline product, does a really great job of asking, who do you go to when you need something within the organization? Who do you go to when you need advice? Who do you go to when you need to redouble down on how do we do things operationally? What is our definition of success for my department, my role, and the company, and how do they all intertwine, right? Like it digs into some of those questions. And when everybody's answer is the CEO, I think that's the kind of the pinpoint. It's really about, who do I ask for clarity? Is clarity something that gets disseminated throughout the organization effectively from the CEO? Are they leading an organization of clear people? Or are they the constant source of truth that everybody has to go through, which usually is actually more indicative of the goalposts that the CEO sets change so frequently that the rest of the people that report to them have ceased to trust that whatever they believed was clear is going to be clear tomorrow. And so nobody wants to stick their neck out in response to people who are asking for that clarity, who are reporting to them throughout the organization. So everybody kind of throws their hands up and defers to the CEO. And so you see that cycle begin to emerge. And if you see that, it's not that it can't be undone, but that is a trained habit. And the CEO themselves has to learn a whole new list of mindset. What is that definition of success, so that they can actually hand off this organization and capitalize on all the things that they were hoping to, because the organization is made more valuable. But also, what does that legacy really look like if you're the linchpin? It actually undermines the legacy that most CEOs want. But when you start looking at some of those data points and who do people go to when, And if the CEO is a response to too many of those folks, that's usually indicative of a number of different breakdowns. The CEO has to learn a whole bunch of new, usually habits and skills, and that requires some pretty direct conversations about what do they want and therefore what tactics really drive that. And then there's just a retraining of that executive team in some of the modes of operation that they've just become accustomed to oftentimes over a number of years.
I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. We're still going to talk about CEO succession, but I want to talk a little bit about internal succession. And so when you think about CEOs that are transitioning and succeeding with the next person, how often are promotable leaders kind of already in the organization, but maybe they're overlooked during diligence, or maybe they're overlooked by the CEO himself or herself? How often does that kind of thing happen?
Oh man, I think frequency wise, I've seen it be very hit or miss. Sometimes I've legitimately seen when there's that transition that we're kind of on the cusp of, and somebody internally they've been maybe biding their time and they've done a great job of understanding operations, and they've got so much institutional knowledge that can really inform great decision making. And a lot of times the internal people that have been there for a long time, they have the backing of folks, and so they have a team that would be ready to promote them if given the opportunity. If you see that kind of leadership already taking place internally, and I really do, when we've used the OHB tool, I really do look for, if there's an individual who a lot of people are pointing to, leadership is taking place at a very high level. The question is, what kind of leadership? Where are they leading these people to? And so sometimes you might have really dynamic leaders, but then you have to go through an evaluation process of really whether or not those leaders are really aligned along with the CEO as to the new objectives that we're kind of locking arms with, the PE in order to accomplish for the organization. And so there are a few evaluative processes there, but sometimes we'll find really dynamic leaders internally, but they're really kind of leading their own agenda, and they're hard to talk off of that. Other times you find really dynamic leaders internally, and they just need to be given the explicit opportunity as opposed to keep continuing to just have the carrot dangled in front of them. And once they're given that opportunity and they can have a clear line of sight, they'll step up, because the idea, just the concept of succession, gets them to kind of redouble their efforts on growing in their own capacity as a leader. And then there's been a number of times, and this is probably 50% plus, where we're walking into this kind of new PE environment. And then when we start talking at scope and scale, the needs of the organization and the needs of the role have now outstripped the capacity of a lot of the existing internal leaders. And that's a hard pill to swallow. And I think a lot of PEs would be really served well by doing some more thorough due dil on the front end when it comes to who do we really have internally, not just currently, but let's think about what that new elevated structure is going to look like, and what's their capacity really compared to that picture, not whether or not they're the person everybody would go to bat for currently inside the organization.
That makes me think about the old adage that what got you here might not be what gets you there, right? And so I think about maybe some of those leaders in the organization. In some cases, they were great getting the business to a point, and then maybe it does make sense to look outside the organization for that talent. But they, at the same time, on the other side of the coin, maybe they weren't put in some of those right positions and given the right autonomy to operate in that way. Are you seeing that as well?
Yes, definitely. I think, and like I said, I think the 50% plus, like I was describing, I mean, from my experience, I've seen it more often than not. One of the reasons I think some internal people, their careers aren't accelerated in the way that you would expect is because it's not made explicit that this is really an opportunity for them, that they're going to have to level up. And here are the specific ways they're going to have to level up in order to do so within this new reality, in order to do so at expanding scope and scale. Because for a number of years, sometimes some of them have kind of hit their ceiling within the previous environment. And so they've been biding their time, or they've been thinking maybe I'll have an exit or something. I'll get an opportunity if I kind of stay the course here. And some people have grown complacent in that process. And those are a lot of times the people who find that they don't have the capacity to level up. But a lot of people have been chomping at the bit and they just need the opportunity. But it needs to be made explicit for them.
So, Landon, I want to talk a little bit about how CEOs can really kind of unpack their value creation levers. Because what we see on the Entromy side is that the PE deal teams and even the portco leaders, when there's alignment on the value creation plan, when there's alignment on the different levers and how we're going to accomplish those objectives, the leadership team functions so much more efficiently. And so I guess my question here is, when you're working with these leadership teams, how much in the value creation plan do you get? And then how much does that CEO succession plan fit into sometimes those value creation levers?
It really depends. It's really dependent, I think, instance to instance. We dig into and I ask a lot of questions around value creation because realistically, if you're going to do an effective succession plan, you've got three-ish key stakeholder kind of parties that you need to consider. You've got to consider, I mean, the deal team, but if one PE entity is the primary, then we've really got to ask, what does success look like for that PE deal team? And then what does success look like for the outgoing founder? And then what does success look like for the person who's being brought in as the successor? And if we can't be explicit about how all of those pieces kind of can actually work together and even accelerate each other, then somebody within that group always has the ability to kind of dig their heels in. And if we're really creating value over time, and especially if you think about at the moment of a sale and how many people, everybody in that room ideally is going to benefit from the moment of the sale, then if we're really aligned on that, then yes, I mean, we can put our nose down, we can do really hard things, we can learn a whole lot of new skills, we can level up the skill set of the incoming successor because they're going to have to step into a new CEO role. The CEO, outgoing CEO, is going to be more likely to want to really invest thoughtfully while getting out of the way to make room for that succession to go much more smoothly. They're gonna be more likely, if we're on the same page about value creation, to be able to kind of get out of the way, even when it comes to managing that relationship with the board. Sometimes that's kind of the last thing that outgoing CEO hangs on to, and that can create a lot of friction instead of really trying to facilitate a really healthy handoff of that relationship. And so I think there's a lot of those pieces at play. And when we get into value creation, we have to think about it from a lot of different layers. And so there's the financial end goal value creation and how it impacts everybody. But then there's every individual's definition of success. And they can really line up. But if we focus on value creation from a financial kind of overall perspective, primarily at the expense of specifically the incoming successor and the CEO's definitions of success, that's where I see the value creation conversation really get out of whack. And then the investor's sitting there going, how do you not understand how good this is going to be for you? And the CEO, a lot of times, they don't even know how to describe exactly why there's so much friction between them and that picture. Even though, yeah, of course I want the payday, but it's not everything. There's just ends up being these kind of funky gaps when we start talking about value creation. So we do try to unearth that early in order to talk about how it's a much more dynamic reality than just the financial.
So, Landon, you've advised these leadership teams maybe getting ready for a CEO succession. Maybe the CEO succession's already happened. And then if it is already happened, sometimes it's going well, sometimes it's not going well. And so I'm kind of curious, from all of these experiences that you had, could you bring us into maybe some of the mistakes that you've seen these folks make? You don't have to give specific names. I wouldn't expect that, but I am kind of curious if there's some common mistakes that you've seen when it comes to retaining founder CEOs post-close, or maybe mistakes in the transition that they try to make away from those founder CEOs.
Yeah, I think a couple that are kind of top of mind would be, I've seen it go really well and really poorly trying to move a founder CEO from that CEO role to like a board chair role. I think ideally, for the sake of the investor and the company's narrative, that's a really great move. but we need to be really explicit a lot of times. And when we're not explicit, this is where I've seen it go kind of poorly. When we're not explicit about what kind of influence does that founder CEO still have in that board chair role? So is it ceremonial or is it functional? And if it's ceremonial, we need to be really explicit with the founder CEO that we're moving you into a ceremonial role. That's not that we don't want your advising. That's not that we don't still value your perspective, but we're going to solicit it. But here is the decision making body. We are not giving you ultimate decision making privileges from a board seat. And so I've seen that a couple of times not be explicit. And so the first 6 months of that transition ends up being this kind of fight and seeing who's still coming up for air at the end of it. And I mean, at the end of the day, it's the investor, right? It's the primary investor, whoever's the majority. And so, we just need to be explicit about that during the transition. Otherwise, it ends up making something that could be a really great somebody riding off into the sunset moment, getting to celebrate them on the way out, getting to reinforce the narrative for the investor that they want to be able to tell to the public, be able to set up this really kind of, like pomp and circumstance in the best sense of the word, handoff to the successor, and really stamp this new person as the leader, can be filled with a lot of friction if we're not explicit about what that move looks like. I think the second piece is not being really specific about what the successor feels like they need from the board relationship and that outgoing CEO relationship, both needs and needs less of, right? So sometimes if there's a leader in the room and there are certain ways or cadences or venues in which everybody's used to hearing them communicate, and the outgoing leader might say, yeah, I'm thrilled that this new leader is taking my place as CEO, but if they're still communicating in all the same places, people are tuned in and kind of trained to default to trying to get that old perspective. And sometimes there just needs to be a clean break for a period of time where they say, hey, this is my last day. And realistically, they're invited back to a conference a year later and they have a half hour to kind of talk about what they're seeing in the transition or something like that. And so we still get to leverage them, but there may need to be in certain places a period of silence depending on what the expected interaction was from that outgoing leader in order to set the new leader up well so that they're the primary voice in the room. Otherwise it creates confusion, right? A lot of it is about making the implicit explicit about every single piece of the transition.
Well, part of that transition is knowledge transfer, right? It's
Certainly.
maybe different behaviors that need to be incentivized by that deal team. And so you've used this term called golden handoffs instead of golden handcuffs, which I think is brilliant. What does a well-structured golden handoff look like to you?
I mean, that can include a number of different things, but I think always thinking about what are the behaviors we need from each piece of, kind of each person within those kind of three main stakeholders, and potentially some of the executive team who we really need to reinforce the new leadership and incentivize the behaviors that we need in order to create the right narrative that of course reinforces the value creation and long term for the organization amidst the transition like that, reinforce and incentivize the outgoing CEO to be really excited and enthusiastic and play ball in the best sense of the word, along with everybody, play nice in the sandbox, to mix metaphor shamelessly, and then to have the incoming CEO really kind of buckle down in some places where they've been accountable up to a point until they're the CEO, and then there is this entirely new level of accountability that they're about to encounter within their first 6 to 12 months. And so I want to think about how do I financially, from a base comp obviously to incentive comp, incentivize correctly each of those groups, but it has to be with respect to their definition of success. I think one of the places that this doesn't work is when we just have kind of a broad sweeping, this is how everybody's going to be incentivized. But the problem is it's just not motivating in the same way to everybody. The incoming person, they may be thinking about, I want to lead this thing through its exit if it's 3 years away, and then I'm looking for something else, but I'm happy to take this thing and really keep it on the tracks for the next 3 years and set it up for a good handoff. They may be thinking, I want to be the CEO of this thing for the next 10 years after we sell. So they're setting up the company that they want to lead for the next decade. And those are two different ways of walking into that room, and they may want to be incentivized differently, and we may want different behaviors out of them. And so I think I don't want to do broad brushstrokes with the way that I incentivize behavior, but I really want to think about what are the definitions of success? What are the key behaviors that are going to be aligned to that definition of success from each of those groups? And then begin to ask about incentive, right? And have an individual conversation with each person about, hey, here's kind of the long-term incentive comp, and here's kind of a base fee or base pay sort of comp, and what else incentivizes you, what else is exciting to you from from a comp standpoint, and just be explicit with each of those people. I think it's, again, implicit being made explicit, and it's less about one paycheck as much as it is having the conversation and making people feel, golden handoff wise, that they are in charge of their own destiny in the midst of this transition. If they feel like they're at the mercy of somebody else's agenda, it's the fastest way to de-incentivize high performers.
So, Landon, I want to talk a little bit about a story I'd love for you to share, if you don't mind, where maybe the succession went right and it had a direct impact on the value creation plan. Obviously, don't want to get into too many specifics, but I'm wondering if you can set the stage just a little bit with some context. When were you brought in? What were maybe the reasons? And then, how did you know that they got it right? What did getting the succession look like to you when they got it right?
Yeah, I mean, this one's a number of years ago, the first thing that came to mind, but I was really brought in the middle of the buy and build cycle. So I think best case scenario is always when I get brought in during due dil, so I can help align thesis with founder objectives from the outset. Then we get to start with a lot of traction. In this case, I got introduced to the founder while they were in the middle of the build cycle. And so we worked on a lot of team communication and executive performance, executive leadership performance, and then began navigating the conversations, because there was just a disconnect that continued to happen. It wasn't outright friction or disdain or anything, but there was just a continual disconnect that kept kind of bubbling up between the founder and the objectives of the board. And so I got brought in to help support the founder and help support their ability to communicate more effectively with the board. And so it was more of a communicate up and kind of sideways initiative at first, only to realize that not too long after we'd gone through 2 or 3 board meetings, we kind of had a come to Jesus talk, so to speak. And he and I kind of together realized over a beer that he wasn't 100% sure what his definition of success was. And it was beginning to get more and more evident. And that lack of clarity for him really led to a lot of that friction or that disconnect with the board, because they actually really desired to support and incentivize and kind of do the golden handoff function, right? Like, they actually desired that, but he couldn't articulate what he wanted well enough for them to build a plan around it. And so the first step was we got a couple of days together. I walked him through an intensive process that allowed him to really hone in on what he wanted for his next stage and why. And then we were able to backward plan what would be the key components that would both be kind of functionally and then from an incentive standpoint necessary to move him into that next stage. And once he was clear on that, it became much easier to identify who was the right successor, because there were also 3 successors, potential successors, kind of waiting in the wings. And it felt like a toss up. But the more clear he was on how he wanted to move out and what the function was, the more clear it became about what the leadership void was that was going to be left behind for the company, and what they really needed to fill from his functionality, kind of with them moving into a new, scope and scale. And so once he and I got done with that, we really processed. I mean, it was his plan. I at my best, I think I get to help articulate and act as a facilitator as much as anything in a lot of those environments. And then he was able to present that to the board, and hey, here are the three things that I need. Here are the top three things that I need. And then I just need open lines of communication as we navigate this process. We built back about an 18-month plan for readiness, the successor. And we knew, to your point, that this was moving in the right direction because they were able to sell. They were able to sell once the succession happened. About 6 months after the succession, we coached the successor, the outgoing CEO, and a couple members of the board. Mostly interacted in that in between, kind of helping translate and navigate between the board and the CEO. But we just kind of coached and greased the tracks, so to speak, helping everybody get individually clear, and then kind of greasing the tracks for a lot of those conversations to keep them moving and keep some of the friction that comes up if we're accidental or kind of go back to our defaults. The company sold, and it sold for an amount that made everybody happy. And the founder left and went to Arizona and had a very clear picture of what he wanted to do next. And he was available quarterly for a call for his successor, but the successor stepped in and led the team, and the rest of the team was thrilled and was ready to, like, if the board hadn't promoted the successor, his peers would have at that point. For me, I look at that as that's how you know somebody is ready, and that's how you can have a lot of confidence in the successor.
Yeah, I often think about being the boss or being the CEO is not really the title, but it's more of the way you carry yourself and the way that you're able to articulate the vision and cast this really clear picture of how we're going to get there as a team. Those are the people that I think are generally CEO types, right? And it's less about the title, it's more about their attitude.
Yeah, I think certainly, I think it fundamentally begins with the mindset and the attitude. And I think there is a doggedness about successful CEOs where they hold themselves to high account, but in every way, not just operational outputs. The ones who seem to be successful, particularly in PE environments and in PE transition environments, there is a humility combined with that doggedness for excellence and holding themselves to that high bar. But because of the humility, they're so committed to getting it right more than they care about being right. And it is it when you see it. There is the people that care most about getting it right, they empower people, they trust people, but they're explicit about their expectations. They trust them because they've given them chances to prove that they're trustworthy. They don't just blindly trust. There's that word is thrown around all the time now. Like, well, if we would have so much better engagement if everybody would just trust everybody. Like, well, that's ridiculous. You get somebody on your team, and they need to prove that they're competent and capable, but you have to give them the opportunity to do that because you inherently believe that there's no way you could have sufficient perspective to guide this organization on your own. So there's a humility and just a dogged commitment to excellence and getting it right.
So, Landon, I want to think about maybe some advice. We're getting to the point in our time together where obviously you've got a lot of experience, but now I'm interested in maybe just this one piece of advice that you could give to PE investors looking at ways to de-risk CEO transitions. This is a very hot topic, not just recently, but certainly over the last, call it 10 years as the financial machinations of a, Portco acquisition and then a work through, it's being a little bit more level playing field with the financial aspect. And so now it comes down to leadership and those kinds of things. And so I'm curious if you have maybe this one piece of advice that you would like to give to PE investors looking to de-risk CEO transitions.
If I were to help guide an initiative to de-risk a CEO transition, I think it starts back in the due dil phase when I'm working with the founder at the outset. I think recognizing that oftentimes we just don't know what we don't know. If I'm the founder CEO, I might have to go above and beyond and really pull and mine out their picture of success, their preferred picture of the future, how this is really going to work out. I'd really want to test that against the thesis and do it so explicitly and really not just ask the question, but mine for places where likely friction or dissatisfaction could occur along the way. From everything from, Here's how reporting is likely going to happen in this new environment, and compare that to what you're used to. Here is how accountability happens within this new environment. A lot of founders, CEOs, they're accountable to themselves, they're accountable to the market and whether or not they want their product and what their profits look like, but they're not accountable to other people. And that's a totally new environment. But I'm going to mine and poke and try to expose the holes in order to build trust on the front end, a lot of relational, functional trust on the front end in that environment. And if I can do that, and if we can look at, oh, there's a gap here between how you would just continue to operate and how you're going to be required to operate for us to be successful, and we can look at that together and nobody shies away, and we begin solving for that on behalf of each other from the outset before close. I think every other step from there, including succession, gets built on a foundation of trust, as opposed to a lot of times a foundation, not even of anybody being malicious or trying to hide something necessarily, but, oh, this isn't going the way that I thought it was going to go, and now I need to kind of cover up how I'm feeling here and just be a good soldier and get through until a certain point where I'm either out or I get a check or whatever else. I think those are just natural human inclinations, and we actually have the ability to get ahead of it. And I think if we get ahead of it, we create a much different experience, both for trying to help that CEO grow through the process, develop their successor effectively, and move on in a way that really reinforces the value proposition of that organization when it's time for a succession.
Landon, this was phenomenal. Today's conversation makes it really, really clear that CEO succession isn't really just a talent conversation. It's actually a strategic lever that drives things like speed. We can talk about reducing the risk, and ultimately it does impact the value creation plan. So if you're in diligence or post-close mode and want to surface this kind of insight faster, Entromy's tools and advisory can help. Landon, you've used our tools in the past, and thank you so much for doing that. And thank you so much for joining us and our listeners. I hope everyone stays tuned for more private equity impact series episodes. Thanks.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Hey, that was pretty good, Landon. You are...